So, well, a warm welcome to the second day of our Bonn Future Lab, where we here in the room, in the Festsaal, workshop participants work on scenarios, identify trends on the connection between climate change and security. And a warm welcome, of course, to you in the digital audience as well. First and foremost, of course, I'd like to thank our many partners who made this event possible and wish you a warm welcome from them as well. Yesterday and today, we heard a lot about the interconnection of climate change and security, and started today the hard-working workshop members to identify key trends, and today in the afternoon, they will work on scenarios which you may read in the future as well. But as we heard today in the morning in a presentation by Dr. Philine Warnke, strategic foresight is necessary, a broad and inclusive approach, and we may not lose sight of impacts of climate change on related topics to security policy. And especially in the United Nations city of Bonn, which is home to the BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, it rather makes sense to look and to dive deeper into international development cooperation to gain a full picture for our thinking about the future and about many other futures, maybe. And who would be better suited for giving us an overview and insights on how climate change impacts development cooperation and how a fair transformation to global sustainability can be possible than Professor Dr. Anna-Katharina Hornitsch. She is, since 2020, the director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability Studies, IDOS, first and foremost a cooperation partner of the Bonn Future Lab 2022. Thank you very much for that. And of course, one of the major global think tanks on economic cooperation and development issues, directly consulting the BMZ, the Federal Ministry. Professor Anna-Katharina Hornitsch is a development and knowledge sociologist and is a professor for global sustainable development at the University of Bonn, here where we are right now, and works among many other topics on natural resource governance and sense making. Not least, we are very proud, we at CASIS, that she is member of our steering committee. Hence, we are excited for your presentation and your academic as well as policy insights. Well, let us all give a warm welcome to Professor Anna-Katharina Hornitsch.
Thank you for the very kind invitation, for the very kind introduction. I'm excited to be here, to meet all of you, and to turn towards development cooperation, but mainly I will invite you to look into the term of Zeitenwende and some of the discussions on the national security strategy as they unfold also within the context of development cooperation. I had seen in the program that this had featured already to some degree in some of your discussions, and hope to contribute, of course, some of the insights from IDOS. Until recently, we were called DIE, German Development Institute, and renamed ourselves. And of course, based on the research that takes place within the different teams. I prepared a thorough presentation, but I would still invite you to come in with your remarks, your questions also in the midst of the presentation. I'm happy to, if we can manage to make this as interactive as, is it a keynote speech? As a keynote speech can be, to say it that way. And I named the whole presentation slightly differently than what you saw in the program, because megatrends are in many ways, of course, all around and shape very much the work at IDOS as well as within the BMZ, and they will feature in this conversation. But I would like to use basically the chance to pick your brains a little with regard to an ongoing discussion, ongoing thought process around the question of, is there such a thing, and can there be such a thing as a strategy for the global common good? And I mentioned it already, I will draw on the ongoing and quite heated discussions with regard to the national security strategy of Germany that is being shaped right now. It is a discussion that works with a wide concept of security. It places emphasis on indeed human security. So here looking at different types of risks that undermine the security, military risks, yes, defense-oriented risks, but also risks that arise from climate change, from hunger, from COVID-19, from the many different crisis elements that our world is going through. And at the same time, the discussions are shaped by, of course, Russia's war in the Ukraine, as well as our relationship with China, or relationships, I should say, with China, and is a discussion that is working with the logic of defending ourselves, defending and protecting ourselves against threats from outside. And that, of course, is a logic that is very much understandable at the current moment, and I think is not something to be questioned. And at the same time, we also all know that security, safety, certainty are elements that we can't actually create through protecting ourselves only, through a logic of protecting ourselves, building boundaries, creating borders only, but instead have to defend ourselves in some areas and build cooperation and further cooperation in other areas, and create securities, safeties, certainties through peace and through strategic alliances that help us to maintain or recreate peace in the current times. And I will use this thought process of what does that then mean, and shouldn't we, at the same time, while we discuss a national security strategy focused on or building and based on the logic of protecting ourselves, shouldn't we at the same time also invest into a global strategy for peace, for the global common good, a cooperation strategy that reflects on Germany's and Europe's role in the world, but is clearly a global strategy of cooperation that then strengthens the national security strategy, while of course the national security strategy in itself also supports a global cooperation strategy. Well, you can sense that I would argue, yes, that's exactly what we need. And how should that then look like? And this is the ongoing discussion process. This is where I want to pick your brains. I put some elements here, but of course they will be brought up at the end of the presentation in order to then draw on some of the discussions that I try to present shortly, and then come to a few more thorough points. Now, we are all aware that our world is since many years shaped by global challenges. This is not new. Global challenges that can only be addressed jointly. You have already discussed climate change quite a bit, I've heard. We have also just all emerged, maybe we are still in the midst of it, out of a global pandemic. We are going through a geopolitical crisis, and we are going through a number of debt crises. We are in a situation where we can no longer say the crises are sort of following each other, but no, we are actually in a situation where multiple crises unfold at the same time and unfold dynamics between them that we can no longer control. And at the same time, these challenges that take place within a limited space, within our planet, that indeed, drawing here on the planetary boundary discussions, is indeed finite, takes place in a situation where we also observe since many years a reordering of our world. We've been all observing a move from a bipolar world order to a unipolar moment, one should say, probably only, and are increasingly observing the reordering into a multipolar situation. We are also in a situation where especially a sector such as the sector of development policy and development cooperation has to reflect on a very dominant paradigm of the overall sector, and that is the paradigm of modernization theory, a paradigm that was conceptualized in the 50s, has much longer roots, of course, but works with the concept of linear growth that takes place through a number of steps that societies move through, and that can be replicated, that can be basically exported around the globe. And we realize, well, this linear growth pattern, first of all, the export is not as easy as one would have thought maybe in the 60s. Secondly, it's not as much based on internal factors in countries, whether the idea of moving through these stages works or not, as suggested by modernization theory. And thirdly, we are indeed hitting the planetary boundaries with this linear growth concept, and have to reinvent the engines of this economic growth story. And one core element or core engine of modernization theory, or within modernization theory, is indeed science, science and research as an engine for enabling development, enabling growth. And we realize, well, how do we reinvent our production systems? How do we reinvent our consumption patterns in a way that circular wealth creation is possible? What does that actually mean, circular wealth creation? And what kind of role does then research and innovation development, for instance, play in it? We also have learned over the years that there is not just one modernity. There isn't just the one modernity as discussed by Max Weber. And democracy seems to not necessarily be linked with a state that we might call modern. But we have highly modern societies such as Singapore or China that are quite far away from what would be perceived as a democratic governance system. Thus, also here we are challenged to question some of the dominant logics, underlying logics and rationales that have geared the sector of development cooperation for many, many years. Now at IDOS, we're still all getting used to the new name. At IDOS, we work with the concept of global megatrends, which are trends that have been by us, by humans, built up over a long period of time, and that are structured, that shape structure in ways that our decision-making space over future is already predefined in many, many ways. And here we distinguish megatrends of the first and the second order. The first order is marked here in red. These are those that are even more structurally shaping the decision-making spaces today already for the future, and are in many ways determining what kind of dynamics then unfold between the different megatrends, first and second order, but also between them themselves. And amongst those on the megatrends of the first order is climate change, natural resource deprivation, demographic changes, and geopolitical power shifts. And then we have quite a number of others that are here that we conceptualize as megatrends of the second order, such as digitalization and the rise and fall of knowledge societies. I mean, the fall, if you think of some of the fake news debates, for instance, globalization and regionalization processes, social inequalities and the up and down of new middle classes, migration and migratory movements, as well as urbanization. And some of you will say, but this is missing and that is missing. Yes, you can of course sort these mega trends also differently, but why we work with this is it helps, it's a heuristic tool in our work that helps us to bring together research in many different world regions, sometimes working on local scale level, sometimes on the national level, sometimes on the regional level, and on different topics, of course, and place this research in close dialogue with each other in a way that we can then draw lessons from the different, in German we would say Partikularstudien. Yeah, all of them are limited. All of these little studies are only giving us a small insight into the whole complexity that we are trying to capture when thinking about development cooperation and transformational processes. And then we bring these together around the respective megatrend in order to then also be able to talk to policymakers in a way that can offer some kind of ordering and some kind of orientation. And does not fall into the trap of losing ourselves again and again in the different pieces of the overall mosaic. Now, let me go through some of these mega trends that are, I think, especially relevant also when reflecting on such a term or such a moment in time that could be termed by a German chancellor a Zeitenwende. And that, of course, also are relevant when we think about a national security strategy and a global cooperation strategy. Now, you have already jumped into the whole overall topic of climate change as a substantial global risk factor, not just substantial, but probably the global risk factor in terms of future making. And what, of course, for the whole field of development cooperation is especially relevant here is the fact that, yes, per capita, the greenhouse gas emissions in high-income economies are highest. But in total figures, in terms of the overall populations, the continued increase of greenhouse gas emissions in upper middle income countries since 2007 substantially have overtaken those in high income economies. And it means, of course, this is a risk factor we can't fight alone, but we depend on international cooperation. We depend on those G20 countries that are also often summarized as the transition economies that are partly part of the BRICS countries. And with this, I also, just already try to remind you of the fact BRICS, most of the BRICS countries voted on the 2nd of March by choosing neutrality. So we are in a situation where we have to face a risk factor, a global risk factor that we can't face by ourselves. We can't face in alliances with North America only, but clearly we need alliances across the globe, across all income categories of country, different income related categories of countries, but also across all continents. And that also means then probably across all political regimes that you might think of. All is then, of course, something to be debated. But it's clear the risk factor of climate change, we can't fight without India on board, which is currently moving from a democracy to being classified in an authoritarian and autocracy, as well as, of course, China, which as we all know, is not just an autocracy, but openly disrespecting human rights. Now, if we then dig a little deeper and sort of think about climate change again out of the position of what can actually development cooperation contribute to these to this substantial challenge of climate risks that can only be addressed jointly, then it's quite common and also quite useful, I think, to work with the logic of the UN that recommends to think about what are the transformational fields and what are transformational levers. And of course, for this, then it's relevant to look at what are the main sectors that are greenhouse gas emission intensive in different country categories. And with this then should also, of course, form part of the always selective focus of development cooperation. Maybe as a quick detour, just to remind all of us of the fact that development cooperation is, of course, only one external policy field of Germany. It suffers substantially from the fact that often the activities taken in some of the internal policy fields and some of the other external policy fields are not necessarily coherently fitting to the activities propelled by development policy, which of course has an effect also on how our partner countries sometimes perceive Germany, perceive the European Union, if there are contradictions. And I think it's also again and again important to remind ourselves of the numbers, how much also financial potential is actually behind development cooperation. Germany is the second biggest bilateral donor. Yes, that is significant. So we have quite a role to play in shaping this sector, internationally speaking. And at the same time, the official development assistance amounts, globally speaking, up to around 162 billion euro. So that is money. But if you then put it into relation to, for instance, the 750 billion euro, US dollar, 162 billion US dollar, and put that into relation with the 750 billion euro that we just mobilized on the European level to stabilize our economies by countering COVID-19 crisis, we know 162 billion US dollar, it's always seed funds, and it can never be more than seed funds. Yeah? So it's always about finding the right balance between respecting the sovereignty of our country, our partner countries, and facilitating dialogues and cooperation mechanisms with small amounts of money in relation to the tasks, and the challenges up front, that then can be taken further and fostered further by the countries themselves. So this is important, which means, and I just bring it in here because it of course explains why it's so important to think carefully about what are the transformational fields, what are the core fields where Germany should be active, and what are then the transformational levers that have to be invested into. Now I move forward, besides the global riskscape of climate change, we of course also have a situation that especially in quite a number of regions where livelihood security on the level of households depends heavily on nature. If you are living in an agricultural area or you rely on fisheries, then you are especially affected by climate risks in your direct income provision. Now, we of course also see that the climate risks interact with a number of other crises, and I mentioned already the rising debt or the different debt crises and that unfold, that play a major role in in how we cooperate, how what kind of possibilities exist for cooperation in different world regions and countries, but also how the cooperation being offered by, for instance, Germany or the European Union is viewed. We know that social inequalities rise in countries and between countries. And it's not just social inequalities, but it's indeed poverty that has increased again substantially, also due to the COVID-19 crisis. But what I want to emphasize here as part of thinking about poverty as a global megatrend, social inequalities and poverty, this tension field, is that first of all, it is multidimensional. And what is relevant here when thinking about it out of a multidimensionality perspective is education and health and social protection are the three main areas, and with this then also systems that play a role when thinking about how to strengthen societal resilience. We know that by investing into social security systems, into education systems, into healthcare systems, we can have quite an impact on a societal resilience. We also know that poverty is largely female, and that is something that is only known because the institute I'm heading is fostering a poverty index since quite a long time that is actually gender specific. It's the only poverty index that is gender specific, and that's something quite useful when we want to target programs in a manner that it actually meets the poor. In 95% of all countries, female poverty is roughly on average double as high as male poverty, and it's generally also rural. No? And rural means it has climate change and natural resources deprivation has an immediate effect, especially not on anyone, but especially on those whose livelihood systems depend on nature, on environmental conditions. Now, at the same time, and this is now moving, so to say, to the global mega trend of geopolitical power shifts, the geopolitical reordering, we observe since quite a number of years autocratization processes and polarization processes in all societies, on all continents. You can think of Germany, you can think of the upcoming elections in Brazil tomorrow, you can think of the United States, or of the situation in Burkina Faso, for instance. We observe polarization, societal polarization processes across the world, and they go hand in hand in some countries also with an autocratization of the political regimes and with an autocratization of international law, on the multilateral level. And if you then here also think of some of the activities of Russia, for instance, the election yesterday in the Security Council, that build on longer term steps in longer term steps that can be summarized as processes that contribute to an autocratization also of international law. We are currently in a situation where this is the Varieties of Democracy Index from the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Gothenburg. And this index tells us that this year we are living in a world in which 70% of the world population live in autocracies. 70%, last year it was 63%. That's relevant. It means that 70% of the world population also is socialized into autocratic governance practices on different levels, of course, starting from the level of the family upwards. And that, of course, is definitely structurally relevant, thinking about how does that shape future if a large part of the world population is being socialized into autocratic governance styles. That goes hand in hand with the so-called crisis of multilateralism that you've heard since quite a number of years. But yes, indeed, our multilateral system is in crisis. I think the election yesterday in the Security Council reconfirmed this, unfortunately, and the system is in crisis because it has been under attack, and it has been and these attacks came and are coming from a whole range of very different political regime-led countries, and also out of different country income-related country categories. And of course, it means that we have an increasing move towards club governance formats, whether they are called club governance formats such as the G7 or the G20, or whether they are called thematic alliances as being proposed and fostered at the moment around the topic of food security, around also potentially, we will see in Sharm el-Sheikh, the topic of how to deal with climate risks. But we see a move towards thematically oriented alliance building, and basically as an attempt to find ways of multilateral steering that that works with those that are basically on board, and reduces the possibilities of others to undermine, to still move forward on some areas. I said that you are very welcome to come in, and you are very welcome to come in. So if you want to interrupt me, please do so. Yeah, there's you're very welcome to do that. Otherwise, I will push through. But so we just finished a study. It's not published yet, but soon will be published together with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and quite a number of other partners to study China's activities within the development branch of the United Nations system. Here also, just to share, of course, the Chinese practices within the United Nations development pillar are being discussed as potentially also weakening the multilateral system. Our findings are not as drastic, but we of course here observe what sometimes is also being discussed as southernizing multilateralism. There is a redefining of multilateralism taking place, and China is playing a significant role here also because it has a dual position as both a program country and also an increasingly assertive superpower. I think that's very relevant to keep in mind. It is a country that benefits on the one side, but also shapes the system out of the possession of increasingly out of the position of a superpower. Now, you probably have seen this slide a few times in the past days, but when Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February this year, just very few days after our government held a special hearing in our parliament, and Olaf Scholz coined this term, the Zeitenwende, the turning point in history. And I would actually propose to understand it as a term that invites us to on the one side reflect on the ongoing autocratization processes globally, polarization and autocratization processes, as well as the crisis of our multilateral steering mechanisms. This is a situation, sociologically speaking, where you would argue we are in something that you could call a third modernity. The first modernity brought us the linear growth. The second modernity is following Beck, Ulrich Beck and colleagues, characterized by the side effects of the first modernity, such as climate change, global terrorism, etc. But we are now already a step further. We are now in a situation where actually the systems of global cooperation, where we come together in order to address these side effects of the first modernity, are slowly being undermined. And on the 2nd of March, then the first vote took place with regards to the resolution against criticizing this breach of international law by Russia. 141, I think you know the numbers, 141 countries voted for the resolution, 5 against it. But also we had 35 who decided to, or attempted to try and remain neutral. And if you look at the map, these are the gray countries, and the white ones are the 12 countries that didn't attend the election. So we have here actually 47 countries that somehow expressed in their behavior the attempt to remain neutral. Partly, I think the reasons, and that's also what we get from our partners, the reasons differ, of course, from country to country, but many of those countries are in heavily dependent positions. I must say that a situation such as in Uzbekistan to not attend this election, Uzbekistan heavily dependent of Russia, economically speaking, in many, many ways. They decided not to attend the election in March, but yesterday decided to not transfer Russian to-be soldiers, you could say, that fled Russia back to Russia, and clearly said, the government statement clearly said, Uzbekistan asks Russia to solve its problems in the Ukraine in a peaceful manner. That is a statement. That's a clear statement. And in what I'm trying to get at is we have to look at the voting behavior out of the different country contexts and reflect on different dependencies. But of course, we are in a situation where this Zeitenwende on the one side is a crystallizing point that that has been built up over a long period of time, polarization, autocratization processes, and a crisis of multilateralism, both suffering under the pressures of a climate crisis, etc. And on the other side, it's a call for action. It's a call for a different type of policy making, a policy making that can actually somehow contribute to addressing these multiple crises. Now, I'll turn to the actual field of development cooperation and then slowly come to an end. Development cooperation is development policy making is, I said it already, it's a field where there's always, it's an attempt to, through seed funds, through long-term cooperation, foster joint dialogue processes and invest into change processes. And the ambition, of course, is always that this development policy has to be structural policy making. So it's always a type of policy making that invests into long-term cooperation, and long-term cooperation in the interest of, and I'll jump to here principle 4, in the interest of facilitating change processes towards future sustainable futures. But what are sustainable futures? Of course, we have the Agenda 2030, and I think all of us know that within the Agenda 2030, of course, it requires the respective discussion processes in each country, in each society, even in each social group, to reflect on what do you perceive and expect to be a sustainable future? How do you define it? And how do you then pursue it? And that, of course, can be supported by a development policy, but cannot be carried on by development policy only. The new German, the new leadership within the BMZ, within the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, placed an emphasis on 4 areas. I apologize that this diagram is still in German, but basically they said we bring in a focus on health, a focus on multidimensionality of poverty and hunger, a focus on just transition, so fostering transformational processes that are basically decarbonizing societies, and fostering a turn in energy production and use, that in a way that they are at the same time socially just, and the field of feminist development policy. That means that these 4 priority areas were placed sort of you could say, diagonally or contribute to 6 core areas. 5 of those had been defined already before, but the 6th one have social security and demography came in. I won't go into much more detail, but we can do that in the discussion. Relevant, of course, is then always to reflect on what are the partner countries and the priority areas, and what are the transformational levers to be fostered. I'll jump a little because I want to take a little time for this. Now, I mentioned earlier at the beginning that within the ongoing discussions with regard to a national security strategy, we have this wide concept of security. It is about human security. You have the climate risks in there. You have the hunger risks in there. You've got the risks due to debt crisis, theoretically in there. But of course, it is dominated by the war in Ukraine, and with this, it builds on a defense logic. When we now think about an additional strategy, a strategy for a global strategy, global cooperation strategy, but clearly with a slightly different aim, not just the aim of security and certainty, safety as the aim of the strategy in itself, but the aim to foster peace, to foster a global common good, and to do that through the means of cooperation, and of course then achieve security, so to say, on the side. That's a different type of strategy, but it's a strategy that actually can promise to us a longer term type of security. The national security strategy is necessary, but that comes in when when security guaranteed through cooperation and peace is failing. So it's serving, the national security strategy has to serve the moment of cooperation and has to serve a strategy for that takes peace and a common global common good as the reference point, not the other way around. And when I then think about a global cooperation strategy for the global common good, we've got the megatrends in the back, we've got the institutional landscape that is limited in its possibilities, that it's ambitious but still limited, on the national level just as much as on the regional or multilateral level. But we still hear from our partner countries and from for instance the negotiations on the level of the General Assembly of the United Nations now just in the past 2 weeks, we hear loud and clear that our credibility is not there, and that without basically some of the countries that we so desperately need as our cooperation partners in order to address the climate crisis, question whether we are actually reliable partners, then I think it's quite obvious that we need to invest into our own credibility, and that is something that we can't do as a second bilateral donor ourselves only, but we have to do it beyond the area of development cooperation. And that is a task that Germany has to take forward within the context of the European Union. So basically, I'm arguing this global cooperation strategy then has to have 5, or should be thought about by reflecting on 5 principles. It has to be European and geostrategic strategy. Basically, the Green Deal of the European Union has to become a bit more social, and the Global Gateway Initiative has to become a bit more green, to put it in a simplified manner. And both actually have to be now put into action. Also here, credibility, also if you think of the African Union, European Union Summit, it's important to show action. Then of course, second, it has to be cooperative and coherent. We need to invest into long-term strategic partnerships. Strategic doesn't mean that it always has to be only in our self-interest, but the areas of interaction have to be defined together, but they have to be strategic in the sense that it's clear we need partnerships across all continents and across all country categories with regard to income levels. And we need to invest substantially into the coherence between internal and external policy fields. Doesn't make it, it undermines our credibility enormously when we invest into ethical standards and value chains with some partner countries through development cooperation, but then foster different policy making through our internal policy fields, do not reflect on our spillover effects in our own consumption patterns, etc. It has to be based on forward-looking solidarity. So it's very clear that we need to find ways of fostering dialogue processes on the level of club governance formats as well as the multilateral level to basically, to support countries in restructuring their tax systems in a way that they can then actually invest into their own healthcare systems, into their education systems, and into social security systems. These three areas are absolutely crucial for societal resilience, and they can't be financed through ODA. There's no way of ODA financing the social security systems of the world. No way. You just need to look at the budget of our ministry in charge of social security. It lies above 400 billion, I'm sorry, and then look at the budget of our development cooperation ministry, around 12 billion. And you know already, no way. Yeah? So it's clear that it has to be actually financed by the countries themselves, but that requires political will, it requires restructuring of tax systems, and then of course the decision-making to actually finance, to actually invest into your own people, into your own people and into future generations' education. And so it has to be geared by transformative and climate stabilizing activities. Here it is about finding ways of restructuring our production systems in a CO2, in a greenhouse gas neutral manner. And we speak out for democracy protection. It's clear that we will partner and are partnering with, for instance, China on the climate front. There's no way around it. But that also means and requires a clear statement for standing in for democratic principles, and also to not only foster democracy, that is of course being discussed, but actually invest into its protection, and by doing that, investing into conflict prevention and also then the democracy promotion. I'm underlining this because we do not have a strategy on democracy promotion or protection on the level of the German government. The word democracy is also not to be found in the organigram of the Development Cooperation Ministry, but it has slowly over many years been, in many sectors, been replaced by the term governance. But governance can entail democracy protection. It can, but it can also be very technocratic governance. It can be an investment into very functional governance practices, into the fostering of capacity development within a bureaucracy. So democracy requires some attention. And at the same time, it's of course a substantial search process also on the level of the German government, how to work with the situation of needing to cooperate with autocracies, but in a way that it does not undermine our own democratic, inclusive, etc. institutions. And of course, then there's a reflection. It's my last slide. I apologize. Reflection on which are the fields for action. and what are then the transformative levers. I think the fields for action are quite clear already, but just to mention, out of the logic of also within UN context discussions and development cooperation, it's important to really pay close attention to our finance instruments. So the ongoing discussions with regard to, for instance, World Bank leadership and its reflections on climate change, they are relevant because the financial instruments that we work with in the process of international cooperation are, of course, are also they can contribute to so-called recovering forward, and linking economic recovery with a rebuilding of our production systems, climate neutral rebuilding or not. And then governance, of course, is always crucial, but also I want to emphasize again here education, science and innovation systems as a transformational lever in itself. You might say, well, that's clear. Well, no, actually within development cooperation, it is not used as an instrument of cooperation or only to a very limited degree. And that, of course, means that we here again need a reflection on the coherence of our different policy fields, and this then regards the coherence between development cooperation, foreign policy, but also research and education policy making within BMBF. And with this, I'll end, and I'm interested in your thoughts. Thanks. Any remarks? Yeah, please. Maybe not the, I don't know about the audience in the yeah, they can. Okay.
This time, thanks. The first question, would you say that the geopolitical development, the geopolitical rising conflict, is an obstacle or a chance for global development policies? And second, what would you say as a global development expert to the whole degrowth discourse, especially regarding maybe the gap in the goals between reducing social inequality and reducing carbon emissions, because of the fact if we want to reduce global inequality, it means either we are facing, as the industrialized West, massive loss of welfare, of material welfare, or yes, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. Thanks, and I'm happy to collect if there. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Simon Schmitz, the LMA trainer. So I'd be curious, how did you come about the 8 megatrends and why 8?
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask, because you stressed quite heavily that Germany should promote democratic values, considering their international cooperation. But like, if we do that, usually the projects and investments we take are so little that autocratic leaders do or are willing to take these investments or the costs or the risk of these investments undermining their own power, because the advantages they see for their own economy or themselves due to corruption are outweigh the risks of undermining their power. So how can we overcome the this problem, this push problem? Because then in the end, you would just like prove each other by thinking they would achieve something, but in the end they don't, because they have so little.
maybe let me come back in first. The megatrends, well, we came up basically by looking at our empirical research over the past years, and then trying to find ways of linking different fields that sometimes are not necessarily so obviously linked, like for instance digitalization and the rise of knowledge societies, but also the discussions on, of course, then the opposite, no, the alternative facts discussions. In other areas, it's a lot more obvious, for instance, globalization, regionalization processes in value chains, no? Or demographic change isn't a field we don't actually work on explicitly, but it's very, very clear that for futuring, it's, of course, a substantially relevant area. And with this, then an area that we basically weave into the work on other megatrends. So in a way, it was a mixture between looking at our empirical research over the past years and, of course, then also linking it with ongoing discussions and then taking an informed decision. If you Google megatrends, you will find slightly different classifications as well, depending on also the organization and their global or not so global reach. For our country contexts, also in discussions with our partners, these 8 seem to be sort of precise enough and wide enough to capture a lot, no? But of course, there are always areas that you say, like for instance, now the field of gender, yeah, you could argue, well, where exactly is that explicitly in? It's not really, there isn't, you could argue there's a degendering megatrend ongoing since hundreds and hundreds of years, and is a turn now, but of course it's then a completely cross-cutting theme that weaves into all megatrends. Yeah, so. Democratic values difficult. Of course, there's the do no harm principle that has to be respected, meaning that if you have to, in any project where you foster democratic practices, for instance, and also practice them, you have to assure that you do not, what you now suggested, finance autocratic practices, autocratic leadership, and contribute through the financial means to a hardening of autocratic practices. Yeah? So there is you have to, through your evaluation mechanisms, assure that you actually then do foster democratic practices on, for instance, a local level by working with, for instance, small-scale farmers, yeah, around crop decision making, but how to then organize their own water user association, for instance, whether it's organized through inclusive mechanisms, inclusive institutions, participatory decision making, or rather autocratic practices. Of course, you can. These are then elements that you can weave in, yeah? And by doing this, you weave in basically democratic, the fostering of democratic governance styles into different types of projects, but then have to assure that the do no harm principle is met. In general, just also to add, I mean, development cooperation, development policy is a sector that that is always under it's looked at quite critically. I mean, we have the sector that gets a lot of requests also from, for instance, the AFD on the parliamentary level, and due to this has built up over a long period of time quite an evaluation apparatus that is now even taking its first steps to invest into cross-sectoral evaluations, such as in the activities of Germany in Iraq or now probably Afghanistan. Is the geopolitical situation a challenge or a chance? it's definitely a challenge. It's a substantial challenge because it's not, I mean, it's not a situation that we are right now in only, but it has been building up over a long period of time. This is why I'm saying this Zeitenwende cannot be reflected on just by looking at the 24th of March, of February, sorry, and then the 2nd of March, but it has to be reflected on by looking at these autocratization processes, the polarization processes, as well as the crisis of multilateralism. And here we do see a substantial undermining of these systems of global governance that that make it even harder now to address the multiple crises. Of course, there's an attempt within the multilateral systems to somehow also discover the elements where it might pose a chance. Yeah? And I just recently could attend the Think 20 summit in Bali. So that's the summit basically where the think tank community of the G20 countries comes together in order to advise the G20. And it was very interesting in regard to your question, because the G20, of course, the presidency this year is with Indonesia, next year it's with India, then South Africa, then Brazil. So we have 4 years in which the G20 is led by large transition economies of the South. And there's a very strong, or at the summit was a very strong sort of Southernized global governance spirit, to Southernize now global governance, which is of course very positive, but coupled then with substantial also sort of uncertainty of what that actually means, what type of leadership should unfold as part of this Southernizing global governance. And there, of course, then the question, and some countries would, of course, then probably spot more areas where they would define a chance as well. You could argue that the current geopolitical situation out of a position of India, for instance, also offers quite a few chances. And if you talk to the foreign minister of India, he will say, yes, we are building our access to United Arab Emirates, and we are developing our strategic alliances out of the Indian perspective and work with the situation, and then also in the Security Council yesterday remain neutral. And degrowth, difficult question. My economists at the Institute say degrowth is not the way to go, especially not out of a development perspective. That has to do, of course, with the demographic bulge in Africa and parts of Asia, but especially Africa, and the necessity to invest into job creation in local contexts in Africa and Asia, and this job creation at large not taking place if we now here restructure our value chains geared by a degrowth paradigm or geared by a regionalization only paradigm either. At the same time, of course, growth in the current greenhouse gas intensive manner is also not an option. So I think the attempts to find ways of circular wealth creation, so basically greenhouse gas neutral wealth creation, are the way to go, but we don't really have the answers there yet, or not. Yeah. Other remarks? Yeah, please.
Talk about coherence a couple of times.
Appearance? Coherence. Mm-hmm.
How coherent are foreign policy and development, German development cooperation? And is German development cooperation sufficiently thinking and working politically? And if not,
yeah, good question. I collect, but yeah. I saw one more here somewhere. Yeah.
I was wondering, when you speak about policy for the common good, whether you're referring to the common good of individual people across the world or the common good of the community of states, I imagine that's something that's good for North Korea, and thereby possibly good for the individuals living in North Korea, might still not be good for the society in North Korea as a for example. But many states separate between being, good for the average person in that country and perhaps a minority in that country, or being good for the person in that country but not for the neighboring country. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, for example.
Thanks. And yeah.
The funding is the inequality. We talk about around 62, I guess, billion euros US dollar. Doesn't change much at the end. That's like 10% of Apple's net worth right now. So how can we mobilize more private money from companies, private persons, like via private-public partnerships to develop it?
Yeah, thanks. And last call, because I realized that we're already over time. Is there any last remarks? I don't see. Yes, please. Sorry.
Perhaps a brief remark on your point of view, the role of regionalization. Europe that we consider the region in forms of also addressing the conflict, international peace and security, but also to foster the international public law.
Thanks. Yeah, coherence. I mean, development and foreign policy, of course, they have different mandates and they are geared by different logics. Development policy is geared by a logic of a solidarity-based logic and enabled through forms of cooperation. Sometimes they're economic, sometimes they're more political, etc., but forms of cooperation. Foreign policy is geared by a logic of diplomacy. And of course, then there is also the element of humanitarian aid. No? So, and that makes it insofar relevant because they work with different time spans in many ways. No? Humanitarian aid, there's a very short-term and immediate action and reaction. Development policy is generally aiming for structural policy making, so we are there immediately in a mid to long term time frame. Are they coherent? Well, I think we can, I think that is a question that you can only answer by looking at concrete examples. Yeah, and if you then look at a concrete example, for instance, in Afghanistan, or also what's now being discussed with regard to Ukraine, you see a lot of elements where they clearly complement each other, time-wise, I mean, perspective-wise, but also in terms of their instruments and also in terms of the institutional landscapes that they can work with. Yeah, meaning development cooperation has, I shouldn't say army, but a whole apparatus of implementation agencies, while the foreign ministry has the representations of Germany, and you need both basically. But of course, we also know that not always it aligns, yeah. And of course, in the case of Afghanistan, for instance, we had, of course, then also the defense logic in addition come in that created a situation where we then, where you then have the sort of mixing of logics in a manner that is not fruitful anymore. You can't say you build up. Mainly you invest in, for instance, northern provinces where the military is especially present. You can secure the staff of GIZ while they implement their projects. Yes, of course, you can guarantee their security in that moment because you have the military present, but you have the military present because it's an unstable region, which means the implementation of mid to long-term projects is even harder. Yeah. So then, of course, you need to think it through out of a number of different perspectives, out of the perspective of your own staff, so to say, yeah? Those that you send into the field, those that you pay with German taxpayer money, that all of us in many ways are involved into that whole endeavor, sometimes more directly, sometimes less directly, or you think it through out of the perspective of long-term transformational change, which then changes the picture completely. Yeah? So there is coherence given, and there is also lack of coherence given, depending on the situation. The global common good, we work with this concept at the Institute, and what is relevant to us here is first to say there's the global common good. It's not different types of global common good, but there's one global common good, meaning it's the ambition to assure global common good for everyone, and that answers the question. It works with a societal perspective, not a state-focused perspective. Of course, that also then is relevant for discussions out of a post-colonial, decolonial, UN perspective, etc. Perspective. Mobilize finances, I mean, how to, that of course is the major question in climate policy, just as much as in development policy, how to mobilize the billions and billions in private hand that make ODA look, or that dwarfs ODA next to them. I don't have an answer to it. I can't give you any other answers than you know already. Of course, there's a public-private partnership approaches. We also know that they often don't work because they do work with different logics. So there has to be awareness raising amongst the private sector for the value of basically investing in business that meet the standards of not just the Lieferkettengesetz, to say that bluntly, but go far beyond, out of an own encouragement in ecological terms as well as in social terms. And here, just to also stick with the logic of what are the levers, value chains are our levers. They are substantial levers. They are leverage points. And of course, the current value chain law on the level of Germany is only a first attempt, but it is being now discussed on the European level. And out of a development perspective, out of a sustainable or the global common good perspective, it is important that we move forward there and find ways of encouraging social entrepreneurial spirits, social and also ecologically reflected. And regionalization in many areas, regionalization, I would say, is actually a crucial answer. If you think of, for instance, cross-border natural resources management, it's clear if in the marine areas, just as much as with regard to terrestrial contexts, ecosystems don't stop at a political border. But regionalization here is crucial, and of course also always a peace-building exercise in many ways, whether you think of the European Union or ASEAN or other contexts. At the same time, with regard to the global challenges, climate change, regionalization is not the answer. There it can support and has to play an important role, but we then need the coming together on the multilateral level. I hope I could answer most points, and I hope I could encourage some of the further discussions. I thank all of you for your insights and for giving me an insight into your thought processes. And wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Anna-Katharina Hornitsch, for your insights. I think we here and you digitally have learned a lot how to combine similar discourses, maybe tackling the same challenges, and with a strong view of the future. And we have learned here for our workshop as well many things we have to think about, and we have to keep an eye on, especially tomorrow when we develop our strategies for many different relevant actors. Well, thank you very much for being with us.